If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. My name is Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
And I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor, and poet, and I have a passion for spy stories, fairy tales, and master detective novels.
On today's episode, Melanie pitched Coraline so that we can study subtext. This 2009 film was directed and written by Henry Selick, and it's based on the book by Neil Gaiman. Of course, there will be spoilers because we can't talk about the movie without talking about the movie. And as always, we would love it if you could give the show a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Simply go to the show's landing page and scroll to the bottom. It really is that simple. All right, Melanie, what have you got for the genre of Coraline?
Oh dear. Okay. So for the global genre, I have the first half as an action story and the second half attempts to be a horror. And the secondary genre is a worldview maturation story. Now, I'm going to classify what I've said there. So I am very familiar with the book Coraline. It was one of the books I analysed for my StoryGrid editor certification. And I've taken my analysis one step further over the last 18 months, and I've broken down each scene and gone through this story line by line. The book is exceptionally well written and well balanced. Its global genre is horror. The movie has changed some significant scenes and softened a lot of the creepiness in the beginning half of the movie. And this is why I've identified separate genres for the 2 halves. So Valerie, what do you think about that?
I am so glad to hear you say this. Honestly, I'd hoped to have time to reread the book this week, but I didn't. So I am thrilled to have your knowledge to pull from this week. I'm super glad because it has been a long time since I read the book, so I am definitely rusty. And when I watched the film, this is the first time I've seen the film like from start to finish all the way through, because usually the kids were watching it and I was walking in and out of rooms or cooking supper or something while it was on. So it was the first time I watched it and focused on it. And my reaction was, I remember the book being so much better. So when I really dug into the movie this week, to be honest, I think there's a lot of storytelling issues with the film version. I'm really glad to hear you say that the novel is exceptionally well written, because that's what I expect from Neil Gaiman, and that was my memory of it. I think in terms of genre, they attempted a horror story, but I think they failed miserably. And while I absolutely love, like capital L love, stop motion animation, I think in this film, it overpowered the storytelling rather than enhanced it. So it's kind of like Dune and some of those other CGI heavy movies that we've looked at in the past, in the sense that the spectacle of the movie has overtaken the writing.
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. And because that, although I might not have it in this episode, that is exactly what I was thinking as well. The art form or the method of telling the story and what they could do with the CGI actually overpowered the real story and the heart of what Coraline is about. So as we get into this season, and I did promise last week that I would discuss subtext, which is my topic, a little bit more. And the reason I'm looking at subtext this season is because I want to learn more about it and see how I can apply it to my own work. And as I mentioned last week, the more I look at subtext, the more important I think it is for writers to understand. And it is a foundational writing craft concept. Now, I used the following definitions of subtext last week as an introduction, and they were: subtext is a literary technique that can be used to convey thoughts, feelings, and ideas without overly stating them. Now, I don't like the phrase literary technique in this quote because it implies that subtext is always deliberate and controlled by the writer. But as we saw in Home Alone, I don't think that's always true. And I think there are better ways to describe subtext. Now, I'm going to paraphrase some of Dr. Linda Seeger's book, Writing Subtext, What Lies Beneath, to give a better summary of what subtext is. So, in drama, more than any other art form, things are not what they appear to be. People don't always say what they mean. When stories are told well, there is what's said or done, and then there's the truth of the action and the words. So text is the words and actions, and subtext is the meaning beneath the words, and it is the associations with the dialogue and the images. Writers point the way, they suggest. They imply what the story is really about, and audience get a whole lot more information than they could ever get from the dialogue. So, in order for this to work, readers and viewers, generally speaking, have a level of visual and auditory literacy as well as written word literacy. And this is important, I think, as a concept when you're writing and thinking about how to tell stories, is about the different way we absorb them. Now, I'm going to be very broad in my scope of subtext this season because it covers many areas. And these are some of the areas that I look to touch upon or see if we can get out of some of the movies or examples out of the movies that we're going to watch. And it's a bit of a list, so brace yourselves. All right, so subtext can be seen in settings, in weather, in seasons, and in age. It can be seen in a character's skills, talents, and abilities, their educational background, their wealth or lack of wealth, their religion or lack of religion, their gestures, actions, and the genre of the story. It can come through in the shadow. So when the shadow of the protagonist comes out and for how long it comes out, and is it disproportionate to the character we see? Now, I hope you can see why I'm excited by this area of story theory this season and how much of your story subtext touches. Now, there is one area that I want to touch on that could be a bit controversial, but it's worth mentioning. So, adapting movies from books can be fraught with danger if they vary too much from the original stories. However, Neil Gaiman encourages interpretations or reinventions of his stories and is supportive of various versions of his written books. You just have to read Stardust or listen to the radio play or watch the movie and look at how he promotes the different formats. He is impressively unpossessive about his work. Now, the medium a story is told in dictates to a certain degree what type of story is told. And we saw this with Lost in Translation last season. This was a story about internal change, and it probably would have worked better in a novel instead of a movie. Now, I imagine when a book is adapted into a screenplay, there are considerations of what would translate well to the screen and what might need changing to make the story more visually appealing. Or how could something in a book be represented differently so that it can be shown and not mentioned? So the format also determines what aspects of the story the narrator or screenwriter want to draw to the viewer's attention. And this can be done via focusing the camera lens in a movie or by mentioning an object or a gesture in a book, or not mentioning or focusing on something as well. I don't want to get too abstract. I want to show some of the examples from the movie and compare them to the book to demonstrate how the subtext changes the story. But before I do, I want to offer my theory on why the movie's external genre is divided into two parts for me. Coraline is a children's story, And the book opens with a quote from G.K. Chesterton. And he says, "Fairy tales are more than true, not because they tell us dragons exist, but because they tell us that dragons can be beaten." So from this, we can surmise that Coraline will be a story about being brave and fighting monsters. And as we discover in the book, it's about fighting monsters that Coraline actually goes searching for. Now, the book is creepy and unsettling from the beginning. The foreshadowing used by the motifs and the symbols and the warning Coraline receives at the start and her first experience in the other world are all consistent with a horror story. Coraline becomes aware of the problems with the other mother and the other world after her first visit. Other mother sends Coraline to play with the rats in her other room the first time she visits. Other mother suggests the buttons over her eyes, or sewing the buttons over her eyes during the first visit. And the tunnel between the worlds is filled with an ancient evil, and we see this from the first moment that Coraline walks through it. The book is also set in England at the end of the English summer. Now, the other thing that's interesting is the real world in the book has a thick forest, and Coraline's home is not represented as run down or dilapidated. Now, the movie doesn't provide the same cues for viewers. The opening sequence is slightly creepy, with the doll being remade in the image of our heroine. Then we transition to Coraline's new house. The real world is presented as stark, muted, and run down, and the other world is painted as delightful and pleasant. The rats are disguised as hopping mice, and nothing's scary apart from seeing the buttons over the character's eyes. And at no point in the beginning half are we fearful for Coraline. We are more interested in the adventure the other world poses. The movie dilates the first part of the story, and the movie is set in the US, and it looks like it's set in autumn or winter, but it doesn't quite look cold enough for winter, so that's why I'm going with autumn. Now, this is my personal point of view about children's stories. Valerie, and I know you write for children too, or have written for children, so pipe in here if you disagree violently with me. So I think children deserve stories that properly investigate fear and being afraid, not watered down versions that remove the majority of the value of telling the story in the first place. If the story is a horror story, then tell all of it that way, not in a way that treats the protagonist's fear superficially. Let it build over the whole story and don't start it in the second half. So that's a very strong opinion, but I absolutely believe that in terms of don't dumb stories down for children. They need and want stories that are truthful and stories that prepare them for real life.
Okay, I do want to jump in here because I do agree with you, by the way. And as a writer myself and as an editor who's worked with a lot of writers, anyone who's writing for children needs to know this. It is so much harder to write for kids than it is to write for adults because kids take no prisoners. And I love it. If your book sucks, they will tell you, and they will tell you immediately and very clearly. In fact, they might even throw it at you. Not that hasn't happened to me. I've read for a lot of kids, and they knock on wood, it all went fine, and hopefully will continue to go fine. I mean, this whole podcast is about the craft of storytelling and storytelling principles and storytelling fundamentals. If you're writing for children, you have to nail them. You must nail them. That is a non-negotiable. And before I had kids and before I started really reading a lot of children's fiction from a writer's perspective, I did have the feeling that, children's stories should be highly sanitized and, everything should be rosy and no conflict. Everyone gets together and has a happy time. However, when I became an adult and a parent and a writer, I understood that that was actually one of the worst things that you could do. Why? Let's go back to what Lisa Cron said. We turn to stories to know what we're supposed to do in the world. So in the real world, there are all of these issues that children are dealing with. They're dealing with all kinds of horrors, right? Real monsters and imagined. And the quote that Melanie gave us off the top, the G.K. Chesterton one, is exactly right. These stories tell us that the dragons can be defeated, and that is so important. So diluting a story for children not only kills the story, but it makes it totally uninteresting for the children, but it also doesn't help the children cope with reality. And that's the power of story, right? And again, just get wired for story and read that book, and what I'm saying will make total sense.
No, I agree. And I do think that children are harder to write for. Getting their attention in a book is very difficult, especially when they have, like you and I have discussed, competing priorities for their time. All right, so it's pretty clear now that I believe that the changes made for the film adaptation have profoundly changed the meaning of the story of Coraline. Now, I've already mentioned the change in setting, and the time of the year of the story is different. So this actually impacts on Coraline's characterization. It also changes the cultural references and the mythic references that have meaning in the book. They do not translate, and at some points are not included in the movie. Now, an example of where they are translated is the ring of toadstools around the well. So that is in both stories, although it's not around the well in the book, but it is mentioned. At first glance, it's a fairy ring, but it's not a very nice looking fairy ring. Like, it's brown in the movie, and the description in the book reads, "There was an old rose garden filled with stunted fly-blown bushes. There was a rockery that was all rocks. There was a fairy ring made of squidgy browned toadstools, which smelled dreadful if you accidentally trod on them." Now, fairy rings are places of danger and are synonymous with witches. In the book, there are many references to witches, but not so much in the movie. So the movie changes the witch's reference to a water witch because Coraline is searching for the well. And the reference to witches is very specific around the well and not the larger story. So that is a significant change, and it does take away some of the meaning of the story, I think. So despite this difference, the visual of the brown toadstools in the movie are a warning of some sort. They add to the dark scenery and the sense of foreboding, but do they carry any weight? Did you even notice them? And I'm asking the next question because I don't know the answer. But do fairy rings carry the same sense of foreboding in the US as they do in European myths and legends? And, please feel free to message me if you actually have an answer to that question on Twitter, in particular at Melanie Hill Author. But and this goes to subtext and context as well in storytelling. So Coraline in the movie is much meaner than Coraline in the book. In the movie, she calls the cat mangy, and she calls Wybie a psycho nerd and hits him. She's also very threatening towards him when she's hitting the stick against her hand as Wybie is leaving. So this does set up one aspect of the maturation arc for Coraline, and we pick up where she needs to change pretty easily. Now, in the book, Coraline is the only living child. She is alone in a world of adults, and this makes her lonely and magnifies her willful and petulant behaviour. In both cases, we see the truth of Coraline's behaviour, and we inherently understand one of the areas that she needs to change. And in fact, we expect it. We want to see Coraline in the movie be kinder to Wybie at the end. Now, none of this is stated overtly in either story, We are sensing Coraline's words, her actions, the tone of the setting, the music, and we also have a cultural understanding of what's right and wrong. And we are picking up all of this because it is all subtext. Another interesting focus in the movie is on Other Mother's hands. We see the spindle fingers during the opening, and there are full screen shots of Other Mother tapping her fingers at the kitchen table when they first have dinner when Coraline arrives in the other world. We see them again just after Other Mother asks Coraline to sew the buttons over her eyes. And when Other Mother hugs Coraline at the start of her rescue mission, the fingers have changed. They become long and bony. And then when Coraline proposes to play the game with Other Mother to rescue her parents, we again see the bony fingers come fully into screen and interact with Coraline. And then finally, when Coraline faces Other Mother in the drawing room, that is when her hands resort to being the metal spindles that we see in the opening. Now, Other Mother's right hand also detaches and chases Coraline back into the real world at the end of the story. So right hands are symbols of power. And in the movie, it's mostly the right hand that the camera focuses on. Other Mother's hands grow more and more spider-like through the movie, and so does she. So spiders are spinners and weavers of destiny, or they are malevolent forces of entrapment and death. So Other Mother turning into a spider is symbolic of what type of creature she is in the movie. This is set up early in the movie in the opening scenes when we see the needle fingers sewing and the cobweb on the sewing machine. The imagery builds throughout the movie and we understand how Other Mother is trapping Coraline. And I don't know anyone who enjoys or likes the feeling of a spider's web on their skin or the idea of it on their skin or in their hair. So the clues in the movie are visual. However, we do hear tapping fingers turn into clicks as her fingers change. Now, the use of spider webs and spiders imagery in the book is very different. We are told early that spiders make Coraline intensely uncomfortable. There are numerous webs or the feelings of webs in the story. The other Miss Spink and Miss Forcible are wrapped in a sack like a spider's egg sack when Coraline gets the ghost marble from their grasp. When Kat and Coraline are discussing the small size of the other world, Kat says in the book, spiders' webs only have to be large enough to catch flies. And Other Mother's hands, or her right hand, is described as a spider, and it always scuttles across the floor or moves in a spider-like manner. However, there is only one spider in the book, and it actually scuttles over Coraline's hand when she's trapped in the cupboard behind the mirror. Now, the consistent use of spider imagery or sounds is common in both formats, but there are differences in how this imagery is used and presented as a threat to Coraline. One way is not necessarily better than the other, but understanding how to use words or images to create the feeling of being trapped in a web in different mediums can help you layer the meaning in your story. And you can be conscious of that meaning and the use of images and their association as you write. Now, I do like the book Coraline much more than the movie, but there were some stunning visuals in the movie version in the other world that I think are worth noting because it is actually very pretty to look at. So the flowers and the gardens and the mechanical grasshopper and the kitchen make the other world far more appealing to Caroline. Oh my God, I did what everyone else does and I got her name wrong. That's terrible. And that has significance in both stories as well, getting Coraline's name right and wrong. So that's terrible. So, but these images actually make the other world more appealing to Coraline. And I also think the collapsing of the outside scenery in the other world is very well done. And it is very clear that Coraline is trapped and there is only one way out of the other world. So Caroline, so Valerie, what did you make of the middle of Coraline?
Well, to be honest, I struggled this week. Last week when we did Home Alone, I had so much to say that I ended up cutting out a lot of things so that we didn't end up with a 2-hour episode. And I think I spoke really fast to try and fit in everything I did want to say and keep the episode at a reasonable length. This week, I'm struggling to come up with enough to say. Now, the main problem with this movie for us as writers is that there isn't much story here. There is a tremendous amount of world building. There is an embarrassment of riches in terms of voice talent. And the stop motion animation, it truly is a feast for the eyes. So gold star for all that kind of stuff. In terms of its ability to entertain children, from what I can tell, it seems to do that very well. But since this is a podcast about writing for writers, when I set all of that other stuff aside and focus on the story, because that's what we as writers can control, there's really not much left. So let me give you a bit more detail, a bit more of an explanation about what I'm talking about. Alrighty. So one of the storytelling principles is that we can't repeat the same plot point or the same complication in exactly the same way. And there's a really logical reason for this. If the reader or viewer has seen it once, then they know what's going to happen, which means it's not interesting the second time around. And that is when they will put your book down. Trust me. Now, later this season, we're going to be studying Groundhog Day. And the premise there is that the same day repeats over and over again. And this was my movie choice, and I specifically chose it because I wanted to study this principle. I want to see how they've done it. They must alter it somehow, but I can't remember how. But it's this idea of no repetitions in a movie that's all about the same day repeating that I want to see, that I want to learn more about. So in Coraline the movie then, Coraline the girl goes into the other world twice without much happening. The first time she goes through, she meets her other parents, has a good meal, and generally enjoys her time. Her second visit is much the same. It's a longer visit, and she meets the other YB and the other versions of the Pink Palace apartment tenants. But nothing really happens in either visit. They're both world-building visits. It's not until her third visit, when the cat follows her, that the story, in my opinion, really gets going. It really kicks in. The cat following her immediately makes this third visit to the other world different. So instinctively, the viewer knows something new is about to happen. So this leads me to world building. Stories that take place in worlds other than our contemporary society need to spend time developing that fictional world for the reader or viewer. So stories that are science fiction or fantasy or historical fiction, for example, those stories all tend to be longer in novel form in particular than, a contemporary story, because describing the world chews through the word count pretty quickly. Now, the world that a story is set in should enhance the story, not eclipse it. And in this film version, they spend so much time building the world that they run out of time to tell the story. And unfortunately, the world building happens in clips that aren't working scenes. For example, when we meet Miss Spink and Miss Forcible the first time, we're treated to really fun performances by French and Saunders. But nothing happens. It's not a working scene. There's no conflict. Yes, they're bickering, but that's not conflict for a working scene. Coraline is a passive protagonist. She's just sitting there drinking her tea and listening to them. And at the end of this little bit, Coraline is exactly in the same position as she was before she went in to visit them. So nothing has changed for her. And the same thing happens the first time Coraline meets Bobinski. She's a passive character in that story, in that bit. I don't want to call it a scene because it's not a working scene, but she's just watching him bounce all over the place, and we're listening to him and getting to know about his mice and that sort of stuff. So in the other world, when we see Babinski's circus and the Spink forcible performance, which I didn't think was really that kid-friendly. I'm just saying that surprised me. I wasn't expecting such naked women in a kid's movie. Anyway, those bits, they're fun visually, but those aren't working scenes either. That's dancing, it's music, it's a few gags, but it's not working scenes. So these 4 passages, right, meeting Forcible and Spink and Babinski in the real world, and then the 2 scenes where we meet them, or the 2 bits where we meet them in the other world, they take up 17 minutes of a 90-minute movie. So that's 20% of the movie. That's a lot. And these are just a couple of the examples of exposition. So that's unfortunate. All right, so let's talk about the middle then. In terms of middle builds of stories, what can we learn from Caroline? I did it too. What can we learn from Coraline? Well, here's my best take on it. Somehow I feel like Neil Gaiman knows I just did that. Okay. So first of all, Coraline, the story is not a fully realized arc plot story. I think it's closer to a mini plot story where the shape of a story is suggested rather than developed. With that in mind, the middle build as a whole is approximately 55% of the story, and I'm dividing it into 2 parts, middle build 1 and middle build 2. Middle build 1 starts about 16 minutes into the film and runs to approximately 52 minutes. So that's about a third of the movie. And this is when Coraline first enters the other world, which of course is the extraordinary world. As I've already said, very little happens in this section. Coraline moves back and forth between the worlds, and there's a lot of world building, and that's kind of it. Middle build 2 is about 13 minutes, and it's like roughly from the 52-minute mark to roughly the 65-minute mark. I think it starts when the other mother says she wants to give Coraline buttons for eyes. This is when, it starts to get real for Coraline, and she decides that she wants to go home and not come back. But of course, she wakes in the morning and she's still in the other world, not in her own bedroom as before. And it ends when Coraline falls asleep in her parents' bed. This is her all is lost moment. Her parents are gone and she has no idea how to get them back. I think Coraline seeing her parents in the mirror is the beginning of the ending payoff. So, unfortunately, I don't think Coraline the movie has much to offer us in terms of learning how the middle build of a story is developed. If you're writing Kidlit, definitely go back to Home Alone and use that as an example. And I know that we will have better examples of the middle build moving forward through the season. Melanie, what is your action step for this week?
Oh, well, just quickly before I go on to that, I think the points you've identified there in terms of it being, not an arc plot story, come back to the genre and having potentially the 2 different types of stories in that middle build section. And I just want to add that if you do go and read the book, you will find, again, like a really good example of how to structure a story that works, because the scenes are in a very different order and things happen in a different way. And so all those major plot points that Valerie mentioned are different, but they work, and they work really well. And it's not a long book either. It's just over 30,000 words. So it's not a book that it will take you a long time to read if you're interested in seeing the differences and using that as some sort of framework for this type of story you want to write. All right, and I could talk for a long, long time about Coraline. So this week has been an exercise in restraint for me. All right, so the action step. So I'm going to project forward. I'm going to do something a bit different this week. So next week, I'm going to look at how to identify subtext. So to get you ready, I'd like you to think about a time when you've identified a conversation that you've had with someone that included subtext. What was the difference between what they said and what they meant? And how did you feel when you realised there was something going on under the surface?
Well, that wraps it up for this week. Join us again next week when we discuss Whiplash, one of my favorite movies. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For even more information about putting story theory into practice, subscribe to my Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle and follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Valerie_Francis or on TikTok at ValerieFrancisAuthor. If you'd like to find out more about Melanie, visit melaniehill.com.au or visit her on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram under Melanie Hill Author. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.